Stop what you're doing. Not metaphorically. Actually stop. Because I need you to hear what I am about to say before the first story begins, and I need you to hear it clearly. Every single person you are about to hear from was, by any professional measure, excellent at their job. A technical writer, an emergency triage nurse, a pharmaceutical manager, a land surveyor, a medical records administrator, a radio engineer, a hotel manager, an ornithologist, optometrist, a 911 dispatcher. People who worked in systems, built records, logged data, maintained files, tracked things with precision across years of professional practice. People for whom accuracy was not a preference, but a requirement. And one day inside their own files, their own systems, their own records, the systems they had built and maintained, they found evidence that something else was also working. Quietly, correctly, in their voice, with their credentials. In the hours when no one was supposed to be there, 10 stories, 10 systems. 10 professionals who found that something had been inside their work longer than they had known to look. From True Terror Files Official, we begin now. Welcome back to True Terror Files Official, the channel that believes you deserve the full truth. Every night, without softening and without apology, because the people in these stories have been carrying what they found for months and years, and some of them for decades. And they are telling you now because the truth does not become less true by staying quiet. It only becomes heavier. Tonight's 10 stories share a single theme, and the theme is this: occupation. Not the occupation of a building, but the occupation of a system. The quiet, sustained, accurate presence of something inside a professional's work that the professional did not put there and cannot explain. Working alongside them or ahead of them or in their voice during the hours when they are home and asleep and verified to be nowhere near their desk. A technical writer who discovers complete, accurate documentation appearing in his project folder overnight, written in his style. Under his credentials for modules he hasn't started yet, an emergency room triage nurse who finds completed intake forms for patients who haven't arrived in her handwriting, accurate vitals, and in one case, an outcome note for a patient who will not survive. A pharmaceutical manager who discovers that controlled medications are being dispensed, logged with proper authorization, on a medically correct schedule to patients who have been dead for months, during a 1-hour window each night when the pharmacy is locked and verified as empty. A land surveyor who opens her field notebook and finds measurements she hasn't taken yet, correct measurements. Confirmed when she surveys the land, followed by a note in her own handwriting telling her not to go to the back corner of the parcel. A medical records administrator who finds patient files in the system for people who haven't been admitted, yet with future admission dates, accurate diagnoses, and discharge summaries already written, and then finds her own. A radio engineer who discovers broadcast logs for programming that aired. During Windows, when the transmitter was physically offline, and pulls the recordings from the server and finds them there, complete and produced and discussing events that hadn't happened yet. A hotel manager whose keycard system shows occupied rooms, correct check-ins, and clean checkouts for guests registered under names she finds in the hotel's paper ledger from 60 years ago. Names of people who died in that building. An ornithologist in a remote wetland who finds that every bird she catches in her nets has already been banded in her number sequence with her. Registration, but with no corresponding field record she can account for. An optometrist who finds appointment cards on his desk each morning for patients who don't yet exist in his system, in his handwriting, and then finds one with his own name on it. and a 911 dispatcher who begins receiving calls about emergencies before they happen, and then receives one about an emergency at her home address. These are not metaphors. These are professional records. Stay close. This is True Terror Files Official, and tonight we tell you everything. Nolan Ashby had been a technical writer for 15 years, the last 8 as a senior documentation specialist at a software consulting firm serving mid-market enterprise clients in healthcare administration, financial services, and supply chain logistics. And he understood his work with the specific and unglamorous precision of a person who had built a career on the single most foundational requirement of technical writing, which is accuracy, not elegance. Not creativity, not persuasion, but accuracy in the strict and consequential sense of a document that guides a human being through a complex system without error. Because a technical document that was wrong was not simply imperfect, but actively harmful, directing people to perform incorrect actions in real systems with real consequences. And Nolan had spent 15 years ensuring his documents were never that, reviewing every procedural step against the system behavior it described, never filing anything he could not verify, maintaining the kind of professional record that his project managers described with the specific and satisfying vocabulary of a team that had never once had a client raise a factual error against a Nolan Ashby deliverable. And he was proud of this in the quiet and private way of someone who understood that the absence of errors was itself an achievement that most people outside the profession did not fully appreciate. The anomaly surfaced on a Tuesday morning in February, 11 months into a documentation project for a healthcare administration client, a large-scale engagement, covering the client's patient billing and records integration platform, a complex multi-module system whose documentation Nolan had been building methodically from system specifications and interface testing when he opened the projects. Shared cloud folder and found a file he did not recognize. A completed user guide for the system's claims reconciliation workflow module. 42 pages correctly formatted in the firm's documentation template with the client's logo, version control fields, and section structure exactly as Nolan built them, and written in prose he identified immediately and with certainty as his own. Not similar to his style, but his style. His specific sentence construction, his preference for numbered procedural steps followed by bracketed explanatory notes, his conventions for UI element references and screenshot callouts, exact rhythm of his professional voice reproduced at a level of fidelity that could not have come from someone imitating his work, but only from someone who had been inside his writing for long enough to have absorbed it completely. And the document was technically accurate, she confirmed by spending the better part of 2 hours that morning, cross-referencing it against the system specification and his own testing notes, finding no procedural error and no content gap in 42 pages of detailed software documentation. And the only problem was that the claims reconciliation workflow module was not scheduled. In his project plan until the 6th month of the remaining engagement timeline, he had not accessed it in any substantive way. He had no notes on it beyond a single line in his project overview document, and he had not written this guide. He checked the file's metadata, creation timestamp, last modified timestamp, author field, and the creation date was 3 days prior at 11:47 p.m. The author field showed his own username, and he had been home and asleep at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night. In fact, he confirmed with the specificity of a person who remembered it was a night he had gone to bed at 10:30. After watching 40 minutes of television, and had not opened his laptop since 9 p.m. And when he checked the firm's access logs for his credentials during that window, he found his account had been authenticated from his registered work device at 11:43 p.m. and logged out at 2:18 a.m. A session of approximately 2.5 hours, during which 42 pages of accurate, client-specific technical documentation had been produced under his name on a device that was in his apartment while he was asleep in the next room. He went through every mechanical explanation he could construct, an autodraft function he had configured and forgotten, a template pre-population tool installed by the firm's IT team, a scheduling feature in the documentation software that could batch produce content from outline inputs and found none of them plausible or real. And he raised the file with his project manager with the careful neutrality of someone presenting a procedural question. And his project manager reviewed the document and its metadata and said it looked like Nolan's work. And Nolan said it was his work in every verifiable sense except the one that mattered most. And his project manager commissioned an IT security review, and the IT security team spent 10 days examining the system access logs, the device activity records, and the network traffic from the relevant window, and found no evidence of remote access, no unauthorized session, no account compromise of any kind, just Nolan's credentials, Nolan's device, and 42 pages of accurate documentation produced between 11:43 p.m. and 2:18 a.m. while the device's motion sensor logged no physical movement and the keyboard's activity monitor, which IT confirmed was functioning correctly, logged no keystrokes. The second document appeared 11 days later, a 61-page administrator guide for the system's audit trail module. Same formatting, same voice, same of hours, metadata, same verified accuracy. Covering a module that had been added to Nolan's project scope in a client meeting 3 days before the document's creation times, TOMP, meaning the document had been produced before the scope edition had been formally communicated to Nolan in any written record. And he brought this to his project manager and to the firm's IT security team again. And the IT security review of the second document produced the same finding as the first, which was no finding. And Nolan installed third-party monitoring software on his work device that would log all keyboard inputs, screen content, and application activity every 15 seconds through the device's sleep cycle. And he ran the monitoring for 8 weeks and reviewed the logs each morning before he opened his project folder. And on the 7th night of monitoring, the logs recorded his documentation software opening at 1:14 a.m. A blank file filling with content over 2 hours and 26 minutes. Keystroke by keystroke in the variable rhythm and correction pattern of a human typist rather than a programmatic text insertion. The logs showing pauses and backspaces and revisions and resumed typing in the specific and organic pattern of a person thinking and writing and reconsidering. And the monitoring software screen capture record showed the device screen dark and in sleep mode for the entire duration. The keyboard activity sensor, the monitoring software pulled independently of the keystroke logger, confirmed 0 physical keyboard contact for the full 2 hours and 26 minutes. And the resulting document was a 38-page regulatory reporting workflow guide. Accurate in every particular Nolan, verified against the system specification, and produced by something that had the technical knowledge of the system and the professional voice of Nolan Ashby, and no physical presence his monitoring equipment could detect. He has found 17 documents in the 14 months since the first Tuesday morning in February, all in his style. All technically accurate, all approved by the client's technical team without correction. all produced during overnight windows in which his credentials, his device, and his voice were at work without him. And he has made two decisions about them. The first is to use them, because the documents are correct and the client's system will be better served for their existence. And the second is to stop reading the timestamps, because he has found over 17 documents in 14 months that the specific knowledge of which hour his professional voice was working in his apartment while he was asleep in the next room is a knowledge that does not become easier to carry the more times he reads it. And he has enough of it already, and whatever is writing in his office at 2 a.m. has not yet written anything wrong. And he has decided in the specific and provisional way of a person who has run out of other frameworks, to take that as a kind of assurance, even though he cannot explain what is being assured, or by whom, or whether the assurance is meant to comfort him, or simply to let him know that the work is being watched and will continue. Priya Suresh had been an emergency room triage nurse for 12 years. The last 7 at Meridian Regional Medical Center, a busy level 2 trauma center in a mid-sized city in the Southwest. And she understood triage with the specific and earned authority of someone who had spent 7 years making rapid and consequential assessments of patients arriving in varying states of distress, applying the emergency severity index with the practiced fluency of a clinician for whom the 5-level assessment framework had long since ceased to be a protocol. She consulted and had become a reflex, the immediate and parallel processing of chief complaint. Vital signs, presenting appearance, and resource requirement that her preceptors had told her would take years to develop, and which had, after those years, developed in exactly the way they promised, not as certainty, because emergency medicine did not deal in certainty, but as the reliable and rapid pattern recognition of a person who had sat with enough acuity presentations to have a feel for where a patient was going before the assessment was complete, and she was regarded by her department as one of the most accurate and efficient triage clinicians on staff, which meant something specific in an environment where the triage nurse's assessment was the first clinical decision that shaped everything downstream. The intake forms she found were appearing at her station between the start of the morning handover and the moment she sat down to begin her shift, forms that were not there at the end of the night shift, confirmed by the departing nurse on 3 separate occasions when Priya asked directly, and the forms were the department's standard patient intake document, printed on the department's paper. Filled out by hand in a script she identified as hers on the first occasion, and confirmed as hers on the second when she compared the handwriting to her own. Signature on a form she filled out that same morning, same letter formations, same pen pressure, same specific way she formed the lowercase r and the capital P. Her handwriting on a form she did not fill out for a patient who had not yet arrived. The first form appeared on a Wednesday in March, describing a 47-year-old male patient with a chief complaint of acute chest pressure radiating to the left arm, onset 30 minutes prior. Diaphoretic, SI level 2, and the form was sitting in the intake tray at 6:50 a.m. when Priya arrived. And at 7:20 a.m., 47-year-old male patient walked through the emergency department doors presenting with acute chest pressure radiating to his left arm. Onset approximately 50 minutes prior, visibly diaphoretic. And Priya triaged him as SE level 2 and moved him to the cardiac monitoring bay, and then stood for a moment in the triage corridor with the pre-filled form in her hand and the patient now in the bay, and understood that what she was holding was not a clerical error or a misfiled document from a previous visit, but something that had known before she knew. What was about to come through her department's doors? The second form appeared the following Monday, a 62-year-old female. Shortness of breath, oxygen saturation of 88% on room air, history of COPD, and the patient arrived 40 minutes later. Matching every detail on the form, including the specific oxygen saturation figure, which Priya measured herself and stood for a moment reading the number on the pulse oximeter before writing it in the chart, because it was already written in her handwriting on a form that had been in the tray before the patient had been in the parking lot. She did not report the forms after the first two instances, choosing instead to document them privately in a notebook she kept in her locker. Recording the time of discovery, the patient details on the form, and the time of the patient's actual arrival. And over 4 months, she accumulated records of 19 pre-filled intake forms, all accurate to the arriving patient's chief complaint and vital signs, all in her handwriting, all appearing in the triage tray before the relevant patient arrived, and the timing varied between 15 minutes and 2 hours of advance appearance. And the medical details on each form were accurate at a clinical level, she began to find increasingly specific. Because the forms were not simply listing chief complaints, but were listing them with the precision of an experienced triage nurse's documentation. Vital sign values that would require a measuring instrument to record. Specific pain quality descriptors that patients used only when asked the right questions. ESI ratings that reflected the patient's actual resource requirements rather than generic complaint categories. And the clinical accuracy of the forms exceeded what could be produced by any mechanism that was simply guessing at what patients might arrive with, and required something with actual knowledge of each patient's actual condition at the moment of documentation. The 19th form was the one that ended Priya's 4-month practice of private documentation and began the period she now describes as the worst 6 weeks of her professional life. The form in the tray on the morning of the 19th discovery described a 44-year-old female patient, Priya's age, with a chief complaint of blunt force thoracic trauma. Mechanism of injury listed as motor vehicle collision, ESI level 1. And in the section of the form where the triage nurse typically recorded an initial clinical impression, it's written in Priya's own hand in the specific notation format she had used for 12 years, were the words, patient known to triage, outcome poor, time of death to be recorded by charge nurse on duty. She stood in the triage corridor for 4 minutes before she went to the charge nurse and showed her the form. And the charge nurse reviewed it and reviewed Priya's handwriting on the adjacent forms and called the department director. And the department director initiated a formal review of the triage area's security, the department's paper supply chain, the overnight cleaning and stocking procedures, and every other administrative pathway by which the forms could have been produced and placed in the tray. And the review found nothing. And Priya requested and received a schedule adjustment that took her off morning triage duties for 6 weeks. And during those 6 weeks, a 44-year-old female patient was brought into Meridian Regional's emergency department following a motor vehicle collision with critical thoracic injuries. And Priya was not on shift that morning, and the patient was triaged by a different nurse. And she did not survive. And Priya found out about it 2 days later and sat in her car in the hospital parking structure for 40 minutes before she was able to go inside. And she has returned to triage since and has not found another pre-filled form in the tray in the 8 months since the 19th. And she checks the tray every morning when she arrives deliberately, before she takes off her coat, before she logs into the system. And she is never sure whether what she is hoping to find there is nothing, or whether the absence of the forms is itself a message she has not yet learned to read. Felix Hartmann had been the pharmaceutical inventory manager at Coventry Valley Hospital for 20 years, 2 full decades overseeing the procurement, storage, tracking, and compliance documentation for a hospital pharmacy serving a 212-bed acute care facility, managing a controlled substance inventory subject to D Schedule 2 through V requirements, state pharmacy board auditing, and the internal compliance protocols of a Joint Commission accredited institution. And he understood controlled substance management with the meticulous and legally consequential precision of a professional whose entire career had been conducted in the knowledge that the medications in his custody were simultaneously essential to patient care and subject to the strictest accountability framework in pharmaceutical practice, and his records were, by any audit standard he had ever faced, immaculate. 20 years of de-equated perpetual inventory records without a single unresolved discrepancy. 20 years of biennial D-audits with clean findings. 20 years of state board inspections producing no citation. And a professional reputation within the institution that was expressed in the specific vocabulary of a department whose director had said, on 2 separate occasions at staff recognition events, that Felix Hartmann's name on a compliance record was as good as a second signature from the DEA itself, which Felix had received as the professional compliment it was, and which he had spent 20 years working to deserve. The discrepancy that began the worst year of his professional life surfaced during a routine perpetual inventory. Reconciliation in the first week of November, a monthly process he had performed 240 times across 20 years. Cross-referencing the pharmacy's dispensing records against the controlled substance inventory to verify that every unit dispensed was accounted for by an authorized prescription and a documented patient administration, and it appeared as a positive balance variance for a Schedule 4 benzodiazepine. The inventory showed fewer units on hand than the perpetual record should have reflected, meaning units had been dispensed that he needed to account for. And when he pulled the dispensing records to identify the transactions behind the variance, he found a series of dispenses: correct dosage, correct frequency, correct institutional dispensing format, attributed to a patient account in the hospital's electronic medical record system. And when he pulled the patient account to verify the prescribing physician and the administration records, he found that the patient, a 60-year-old man with a documented anxiety disorder, had been discharged from Coventry Valley Hospital 14 months prior and had died of unrelated causes 9 months prior. And the dispensing records attributed to his account covered the 4 months since his death, meaning the pharmacy system showed that a deceased patient had been receiving a correctly dosed schedule for medication on a clinically appropriate schedule for 4 months after he died. He escalated immediately to the pharmacy director and to the hospital's compliance office. And the compliance review that followed confirmed the dispensing records were real, genuine transactions in the pharmacy's dispensing system. Not phantom entries or data artifacts, but actual dispenses of actual medication, each authorized with a valid physician credential in the prescribing field, and each documented with an administration. Confirmation in the patient's electronic chart, and the physician whose credential appeared on the authorization had left Coventry Valley's medical staff 8 months prior, and, when contacted by the compliance team, confirmed he had not issued any prescription for this patient or any patient at Coventry Valley. Since his departure, that his credential had been inactivated in the hospital's prescribing system at the time of his departure, the compliance team identified 2 additional deceased patient accounts with similar dispensing patterns: a 74-year-old woman who had died 11 months prior, and whose account showed 8 months of correctly authorized Schedule 3 medication dispenses following her death. And a 59-year-old man who had died 7 months prior and whose account showed 5 months of scheduled pain management medication, dispensed on a schedule consistent with the chronic pain management regimen documented in his living medical record in all 3 deceased patients. Post-death dispensing records shared a pattern that Felix identified during his own analysis of the transaction logs. Every dispense attributed to the 3 accounts occurred during a specific 60 to 90-minute window each night, consistently between 2 and 3:30 a.m., during a period when the pharmacy was in what the institution's operational schedule designated as its closed and secured window. The overnight period after the evening pharmacist locked the dispensing area, armed the access control system, and departed. And before the morning pharmacist arrived and disarmed it at 6 a.m., Felix reviewed the pharmacy's access control logs for every night in the dispensing period and found no recorded entries or exits during the 2 to 3:30 a.m. window on any of the relevant nights. Not a failed entry attempt. Not a door alarm, not a motion sensor activation in the restricted dispensing area, no record of the security panel being disarmed, and the medications that the dispensing system said had been dispensed were, in fact, not on the pharmacy's shelves, their absence confirmed by physical count, meaning the dispenses had produced real decrements in the controlled substance inventory. Through a mechanism the access control system had no record of enabling, and Felix sat with this finding for a long time in the pharmacy's compliance documentation room, before he wrote in his notes what he understood the situation to describe, which was that 3 patients who were no longer alive were having their medications filled on schedule, correctly and consistently, by something operating inside a locked and alarmed pharmacy between 2 and 3:30 in the morning, with proper authorization credentials belonging to a physician who was no longer on staff, producing real inventory decrements in medications that were then going somewhere that nobody's system had a record of. And he has not been able to determine where that somewhere is. It's in the compliance investigation, which involved the DEA, the State Pharmacy Board, the hospital's internal audit team, and an external forensic accounting firm, ran for 7 months without producing an explanation for the access, the authorization, or the destination of the dispensed medications. And the case remains open in the DEA's compliance record as an unresolved controlled substance accountability variance. And Felix has returned to his inventory work and continues to reconcile his records every month. Every month the records are clean. And he checks the 2 to 3:30 a.m. window in the dispensing logs every single morning when he arrives. And it is always empty. And he no longer knows whether to be relieved by that or to understand it as evidence that whatever was using those hours finished what it was doing and moved on to somewhere his records will never reach. Dara Connolly had been a licensed professional land surveyor for 18 years. The last 11 as the owner and sole practitioner of a small survey firm serving a rural and semi-rural region in the mid-Atlantic. And she understood land surveying with the deep and specific authority of a professional whose work was in the most literal possible sense. The determination of physical truth, the accurate measurement of the Earth's surface, the establishment of legal boundaries, the production of a record that would be filed with the county recorder and would constitute the official legal description of where one parcel of land ended and another began, and that record needed to be correct in the way that very few professional documents needed to be correct, because a survey that was wrong did not simply contain an error, but created a legal misrepresentation of physical reality that could affect property rights, construction decisions, and land use determinations for decades. And Dara had spent 18 years ensuring her surveys were never wrong, her measurements accurate to the tolerances her equipment and her training and her professional license demanded, her records clean and her field notes the handwritten documentation. She maintained numbered field notebooks that formed the primary record of each survey's raw data, meticulous, complete, and her own. She was retained in October by an estate attorney to survey a disputed rural parcel, a 12-acre agricultural property in a contested estate matter. The survey needed to establish the parcel's precise boundaries for the estate's legal proceeding, and she drove to the property on a Monday morning with her total station, her GPS receiver, her field notebook, a new notebook, number 41 in her numbered sequence, which she had purchased and numbered and placed in her truck the previous Friday in her standard equipment kit. And when she settled in the truck at the property boundary to review the deed description before beginning her measurements, she opened the field notebook to confirm it was blank, which it should have been, because she had opened it herself on Friday and confirmed it was an unused notebook fresh from the supply. And the first 6 pages were not blank. The 6 pages contained survey field notes for this parcel, this specific parcel, matching the deed description the estate attorney had provided, containing the monument identification numbers for the existing property corners, the bearing and distance measurements for each boundary line, the tie measurements to control points, the field annotation codes she had used since her first year of practice, 6 pages of survey field notes in her handwriting for a survey she had not yet begun, and the notebook was the notebook she had personally handled on Friday and confirmed as new. She did not begin the survey that morning. She sat in the truck for 30 minutes reading the 6 pages with the specific and controlled attention of a Tansing who understands that what they are looking at is impossible and who has made a professional decision to understand it completely before making any other decision. And the field notes were detailed and internally consistent and formatted with her conventions and contained no observable procedural error that she could identify without completing the actual survey. And she drove home and retrieved her notebook from Project 40, the previous engagement, and compared the handwriting across 20 pages of her own recent field notes. And the handwriting in the 6 pages matched hers at a level of specificity that went beyond similar and into identical. The same measurement annotation format, the same correction convention when a figure was revised, the same way she abbreviated the word monument, and the way she notated her instrument height, and the specific and private marking she had used since her 3rd year of practice. A small circle drawn above the measurement figure when she was confident in a reading present on the measurements. She was most confident in, as though whatever had written the 6 pages had not just replicated her handwriting, but had understood the meaning of her private notation system. She returned to the parcel on Tuesday and conducted the survey from scratch, recording her own measurements in the notebook beginning on page 7. When she completed the field work and processed the data at her office, she compared her measurements to the 6 pre-existing pages and found that the measurements matched not approximately, not within a reasonable surveying tolerance, but exactly, figure for figure, bearing for bearing, to the precision her equipment could produce, which was the precision recorded in the 6 pages. Meaning whatever had written the pre-existing notes had achieved the exact same. Measurement results she achieved using calibrated professional equipment in the field on Tuesday. And she filed her survey and delivered the legal description to the estate attorney and wrote up her field notes for the completed project, and then turned back to the field notebook and looked at what came. After the 6 pages, after her own Tuesday field notes and found 2 more pages of notes she had not written. Field notes for the adjacent parcel. Separate 15-acre property she had not been retained to survey, had not visited, and had no deed description for. Covering the boundary measurements of the adjacent land in the same format and handwriting and measurement. Precision is the first 6 pages, and at the bottom of the second additional page, below the last measurement figure. In her handwriting, in the specific and unambiguous notation of a field note annotation, rather than a measurement record, were the words, "Do not survey the back corner of this parcel. Whatever you do, do not go to the back corner." She has not surveyed the adjacent parcel and has not been retained to do so. And she has driven past the property twice in the 14 months since completing the estate survey. In both times, she has looked at the back corner of the 15 acres, the southeastern corner. A low-lying area where the field meets a tree line at the property's rear boundary, and she has not stopped. And she has not gotten out of her truck, and she has not taken a measurement. And field notebook number 41 is in the locked cabinet in her office, where she keeps completed project records. She has not opened it again, and she does not plan to, because the handwriting on those final 2 pages is hers, and whatever it knows about the back corner of a parcel it has never visited is something she has decided carefully, with full professional awareness of what a surveyor's job requires her to determine that she is not equipped to measure. Wren Calloway had been a medical records administrator for 11 years, the last 6, as the lead records coordinator at a regional hospital in the Upper South, a role that placed her at the intersection of the clinical and the administrative, responsible for the accuracy, security, and regulatory compliance of the hospital's patient health information records, the creation and maintenance of the medical record from admission through discharge, the management of record requests for continuity of care and legal purposes, the oversight of the electronic health record system's data integrity across a facility that admitted approximately 8,000 patients annually. And she took this work seriously in the specific, an important way of someone who understood that a medical record was not a bureaucratic artifact but a clinical tool, the document that told every clinician who touched a patient's care what had happened before them, what was being done, and what the plan was. And that a record with wrong information or missing information was a record that could harm the patient it was supposed to protect. And she had, in 6 years as lead coordinator, built a records department whose Joint Commission reviews had been consistently clean and whose physician satisfaction with record quality was consistently among the highest the hospital's patient experience surveys collected. The first anomalous record appeared in the electronic health record system on a Thursday morning. Wren discovered it during the routine morning audit she performed on the previous day's record creation activity, a check she ran every morning to confirm that new records had been opened correctly and that all required demographic and administrative data elements were populated, and the record was for a patient named Theodore Varick, 61 years old, male, with a home address in the county, complete demographic profile, primary insurance verification, it's an admitting diagnosis of community-acquired pneumonia, and a full set of physician progress notes, nursing assessments, laboratory results, and a discharge summary, complete inpatient medical record for a 4-day hospital stay, with an admission date of the following Tuesday for days in the future, from the morning Wren was looking at it. She called the admissions desk and confirmed there was no patient named Theodore Varick in the hospital or scheduled for admission. And she contacted the admitting physician whose credential appeared on the record and confirmed he had not created or authorized any documentation for this patient. And she escalated to the hospital's health information technology team. And the HIT team examined the record system metadata and confirmed that the record had been created by an authorized system user credential, not hers, not the admitting physician's, but a credential belonging to the hospital's admissions workflow system itself. An automated system that created demographic shelves when patients were registered, and that the clinical documentation within the record had been added by credentials belonging to clinical staff members who confirmed they had not documented in this record. And the HIT team's review produced no explanation for how a complete 4-day inpatient record had been created for a future admission date for a patient who did not yet exist in the hospital's registration system. Theodore Varick was admitted to the hospital on the following Tuesday with community-acquired pneumonia, and his actual inpatient stay lasted for days. And when Wren pulled the pre-existing record and compared it to the record created during his actual admission, she found the clinical content consistent in every major particular, same admitting diagnosis, same antibiotic regimen, same laboratory trend, same discharge disposition, and the pre-existing record's physician progress. Notes and nursing assessments described the patient's clinical presentation in response to treatment in language that matched the actual record's clinical narrative with an accuracy that went beyond coincidence and into something she has spent the following year attempting to name and has not yet succeeded in naming. She found 8 more pre-existing records over the following 4 months. All 4 patients admitted after the records appeared, all with future admission dates, all containing clinical documentation that matched the patient's actual hospital courses to a degree she verified each time by direct comparison, and all created by system credentials belonging 2 staff who denied creating them. And on the morning of the 4th month, she ran her routine morning audit and found a new anomalous record. And she opened it and looked at the demographic data, and the patient was herself. Her name, her date of birth, her home address, primary insurance, an admission date 3 weeks in the future. A diagnosis she read 3 times before she put her hand flat on her desk to steady herself. She did not read the clinical documentation in the record, the progress notes, the assessments, the discharge summary that was already written for an admission that had not yet happened. And she has not read it in the 7 months since she found it, because she made a decision in the moment she closed the record that the information in the medical record created for an admission that had not yet occurred is not information she is equipped to carry and continue working, and she has continued working. And the admission date 3 weeks from the morning she found the record has passed. And she has not been admitted to this hospital or any other, and she does not know what that means for the record's accuracy. And she checks the electronic health record system's overnight creation activity every morning when she arrives, and she is looking every morning at the list of new records created since she left the evening before. She does not know whether she is hoping her name is not there, or whether its absence is a reassurance she has not yet earned the right to trust. Tobias Osei had been a broadcast engineer for 16 years, the last 9 as the chief engineer at a regional AM/FM radio station serving a mid-sized metropolitan area in the Pacific Northwest. A dual format, a station carrying a news talk format on the AM side and an adult contemporary music format on the FM side. And Tobias managed all of the station's transmission infrastructure, studio equipment, and broadcast automation systems with the specific and technical authority of someone who understood every component in the signal chain, from the studio microphone to the transmitter tower antenna, who had designed or specified most of the station's current infrastructure, and who understood the automation system, the software platform that managed the station's scheduled programming, logged broadcast content, and maintained the transmission record, with the intimate detail of a person who had configured and maintained it for 9 years and who knew its operational behavior and its failure modes and its quirks well enough to distinguish a genuine system error from a routine anomaly before the broadcast log report finished loading on his screen. The discrepancy appeared during a quarterly transmission log audit, a routine process, in which Tobias reviewed the broadcast logs for the preceding 3 months against the station's programming, scheduled to verify that every logged broadcast corresponded to scheduled and produced content, and it appeared in the AM station's log for the 3rd
month of the quarter
as a series of entries covering programming that aired during a specific window. Each week, when the AM transmitter was offline for a scheduled maintenance period, every Tuesday between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the AM transmitter was powered down for a weekly maintenance window that Tobias had established in his 2nd year as chief engineer, standard practice for the transmitter model the station operated. And during those 2-hour windows, the AM broadcast log should have shown no programming activity because there was nothing transmitting, and yet the quarterly log showed programming entries for every Tuesday maintenance window. In the 3-month period, 12 entries covering 24 hours of broadcast content, logged with the correct transmission power level, the correct carrier frequency, and the correct audio processing parameters. As though the transmitter had been operating normally during windows when it was documented as powered down and locked out, he pulled the maintenance lockout records and confirmed that the transmitter had been correctly shut down and locked out for every Tuesday window in the quarter. And he pulled the transmitter's internal data logging, a separate record maintained by the transmitter's own firmware, independent of the studio automation system, and the transmitter's log confirmed 0 power output during every MCU Tuesday maintenance window, meaning the transmitter had not been broadcasting. And yet the broadcast automation system's log showed programming being transmitted during those same windows with measured audio levels and carrier performance consistent with a functioning transmitter. He went further and pulled the archive recordings. The station's automation system maintained a continuous digital recording of all broadcast content and looked for recordings corresponding to the Tuesday maintenance windows, expecting to find either blank recordings or an audio artifact consistent with a dead carrier. He found neither. The archive contained fully produced programming for all 12 maintenance windows, complete audio files in the station's standard broadcast format, with the production quality, audio processing, and presentation style consistent with the station's regular news talk programming, complete with station IDs in the correct format, correctly voiced by a voice talent whose style he recognized as consistent with the station's standard ID production, and program content consisting of news and commentary coverage of local events. And when Tobias reviewed the dates of the local events discussed in the maintenance window programming, he found that every event discussed had been covered on air by the station's regular programming, but in every case, the maintenance window archive contained coverage of the event 2 to 4 days before the station's regular programming covered it, meaning the archived recordings from the Tuesday maintenance windows had discussed local news events before those events occurred, and the coverage was accurate, not speculative, describing outcomes and details that were confirmed in the subsequent regular programming's coverage of the same events after they actually happened. He brought the archive files to the station's program director, and to the general manager, and to the station's legal counsel. and the legal counsel reviewed the FCC transmission log requirements and the implications of broadcast records showing activity during a documented power down period, and advised the station to file a technical discrepancy report with the FCC, which Tobias prepared, and while he was preparing it, he made 2 additional findings that he included in a supplementary technical memo he chose not to attach to the FCC filing. The first was that the voice talent performing the station IDs in the maintenance window. Archives was a freelance voice actor who had done work for the station for years prior, and who had declined a contract renewal, had not produced any content for the station since. And who confirmed to Tobias in a direct conversation that he had not produced any new IDs for the station and had no record of a session corresponding to the maintenance window recordings. And the second was that the most recent maintenance window archive, from the Tuesday 2 weeks before Tobias discovered the discrepancy, contained a news segment discussing a local story that had not been publicly reported at any point prior to Tobias's discovery, and that has not been publicly reported since. And the details of the story were specific, and named individuals in the community, and described events of a specific and significant nature that Tobias has documented in his personal records and is monitoring for whether they will occur, and he does not know yet whether they will. And the FCC's response to the technical discrepancy report has not yet arrived. And the Tuesday maintenance windows continue. Tobias powers down the transmitter every Tuesday at 2 a.m. and locks it out and sits in the engineering room until 4 a.m. listening to the silence on the carrier and thinking about what the archive records will show when he reviews them on Wednesday morning. And he has not listened to the archive recordings from a maintenance window since the week he discovered them, because the last recording he listened to described, in the accurate and professional tone of a working news broadcast, something that had not happened yet, and the accuracy of everything else in those recordings has given him a specific and unwelcome reason to believe that it will. Seraphina Vallo had been the front desk manager at the Aldermore Hotel for 14 years, a historic property in a mid-sized city in the American South. A 6-story brick building constructed in 1921 and operating continuously since. Currently an independently owned boutique property with 87 rooms, a ground floor dining room, and the specific and layered institutional character of a building that had been hosting guests for over 100 years. A character that Seraphina had come to know with the intimate and detailed familiarity of someone who had spent 14 years learning its idiosyncrasies, its mechanical temperament, its seasonal patterns of occupancy, and the particular way it settled in cold weather, and the particular way the third-floor corridor smelled in late summer. And she managed its front desk operations with the professional warmth and operational precision of a hospitality professional, who understood that her role was the first and last impression of a building she genuinely cared about. And she cared about it in the specific and unglamorous way of someone who had chosen to stay in a job for 14 years. Because the building itself felt worth caring for. The hotel's property management system had been upgraded 3 years prior to a cloud-based platform that integrated the reservation record, the keycard access system, the housekeeping management module, and the billing and checkout workflow into a single interface. And Seraphina had managed the transition and become the staff's primary system resource, understanding the platform at the operational level of someone who had used it daily for 3 years across every function it performed. And it was the keycard access log, which she reviewed each morning as part of the opening security check, that first showed her the anomaly. The keycard system logged every room access event, door unlock, door lock, the credential used. The time and the morning review was a 30-second scan for any after-hours events that required explanation. And on a Wednesday morning in late October, she found an access event for room 318 at 2:47 a.m., a door unlocked by a keycard credential. The room shown as occupied in the system. An active reservation, and when she pulled the reservation record for room 318, she found a guest registered under the name Edmund Albright. Check-in date the previous evening, one-night stay. A credit card authorization on file, no special requests. She went to the front desk's physical check-in log from the previous evening. The property maintained a handwritten register in addition to the digital system as an operational backup and as a nod to the building's historic character, and found no check-in entry for Edmund Albright. And she reviewed the evening desk clerk's shift notes and found no record of checking in a guest by that name. And she went to the third floor and knocked on the door of 318, and the room was empty in the standard way of an acute, unoccupied room made quiet, undisturbed. And she checked the housekeeping log for 318 and found it had not been serviced the previous morning because it had been shown as vacant, meaning no guest had checked into that room on the preceding day through any channel the staff had recorded. And yet the property management system showed an active reservation under a name she did not recognize. A credit card authorization she could not match to a card on file. And a keycard access event at 2:47 a.m. She reviewed the keycard issuance. Record the system logged every keycard encoded. With the staff credential that performed the encoding and the room and the time, and found no record of a keycard for room 318 being encoded in the previous 24 hours, meaning the door had been unlocked by a credential that the keycard system had logged as active, but the issuance system had no record of creating. And she pulled the physical keycard inventory and found the room's key slot in the security cabinet undisturbed, and the 2 spare keycards for room 318 both present. And she stood in the security room behind the front desk for a long time, before she went back to her computer and typed the name Edmund Albright into the guest history search and found a record. A stay in room 318 in 1961. The record originating not from the digital system but from a scanned ledger entry. The hotel's archives extended back to its opening, and the physical ledgers had been digitized in a historical preservation. Project 6 years prior, and Edmund Albright had stayed in room 318 for 3 nights in March of 1961, and the ledger noted his departure. As the hotel's standard checkout notation, and a marginal note in the manager's handwriting that she had to enlarge to read, which said, "Guest did not depart by conventional means. Room found locked from inside. Mr. Albright not located on premises. Referred to police. Case unresolved." She found 14 more anomalous reservation records over the following 8 months, all under names she traced to the digitized historical ledgers, all deceased guests from the hotel's records between 1924 and 1978. All with keycard access events during overnight windows for rooms that housekeeping found empty and undisturbed in the morning. And all with credit card authorizations on file that the payment processor confirmed were valid transaction records with no associated card or cardholder account. And in every case, the rooms were made when housekeeping arrived. It's not made by housekeeping, but made. The bedding smooth and the towels folded, and the amenities arranged in the hotel's standard presentation. And the housekeeping director confirmed on the 4th occurrence that the rooms were not simply unmade rooms that had not been disturbed, but rooms that had been occupied and then returned to a condition better than the standard housekeeping turndown. The pillows aligned to a precision she said she could not achieve consistently herself. And Seraphina has filed the 14 anomalous reservations in a folder she keeps locked in the general manager's office. And she has not changed the historic paper register. And every morning she runs the keycard access log and looks at the overnight events. And when she finds an access event for a name she does not recognize, she goes to the digitized ledger before she goes to the room. And she has come to understand in the specific and unhurried way of a hospitality professional who has spent 14 years caring for a building that has been hosting guests for over 100 years, that some of them never entirely left. And that her job on the mornings, she finds a name in the keycard log that belongs to someone the ledger recorded as not departing by conventional means, is the same job it has always been, to make sure the room is in order when they go. Maren Hoult had been a field ornithologist for 13 years. The last 8 as the lead researcher on a long-term avian population monitoring study at a remote freshwater wetland complex in the northern Great Plains. A research station she had helped establish in the study's first season, in which she now ran with a small team of seasonal research assistants, operating a North American bird banding laboratory permitted bird banding station that captured, banded, measured, and released birds in order to build a long-term data set on species composition, population trends, body condition, and site fidelity across a wetland system that represented one of the most intact remaining examples of the region's native marsh habitat. And she understood this work with the specific and seasonal intimacy of someone who had spent 8 years at the same site, and every month it was accessible. Who knew the marsh's bird community in the way a person knows their neighborhood by the individuals that returned year after year? By the subtle annual variations in timing and composition that only a long-term record could reveal? By the feeling of the morning light at the banding station in early September, when the migration was in full push, and the nets were active and the data was accumulating in exactly the way she had designed the study to accumulate it, and she took the accuracy of her banding records with complete and professional seriousness, because the long-term data set was the point. And a banding dataset with errors was worse than a smaller, accurate dataset, because errors compounded across years into conclusions that were wrong in ways that were hard to detect and harder to correct. The anomaly surfaced on the second morning of the fall migration season's main banding period. She had been running nets for 18 hours across 2 days, processing birds with her 2 seasonal assistants, following the USGS banding manual protocols that she had internalized entirely across 8 years of practice when she extracted a yellow-rumped warbler from the net and found it was already banded. This was not itself remarkable. Birds banded in previous years or at other stations were regularly recaptured, and the recapture of a previously banded bird was a data event of genuine scientific value, providing information about survival, site fidelity, and movement. She read the band number and recorded it in the recapture log. And when she looked up the band number in the banding laboratory's online lookup tool to identify the banding station where the bird had originally been banded, the tool returned her own station, Maren's station, her banding laboratory permit, her registered station code with an application date from the previous autumn, the date when she had been at the station and running nets, but a date she had no corresponding record of in her own banding data sheets, and the band number was not in her master band inventory log, which she maintained with the completeness required by the banding laboratory permit. She recaptured 3 more pre-banded birds that morning, a Swainson's thrush, common yellowthroat, and a swamp sparrow. And all 3 band numbers returned her station and her permit in the banding laboratory lookup. And none of the 3 numbers appeared in her master band inventory. And she spent the afternoon cross-referencing every band number she had ever applied. 8 seasons of banding data. Thousands of records against the 4 recaptured bands, and found no match in any of her historical records. Confirming that the bands had been registered in her name by the banding laboratory without corresponding entries in her own data. She called the bird banding laboratory, and a staff biologist pulled the registration records for the 4 band numbers and confirmed that all 4 had been registered to Maren's permit on their respective application dates with the species, age, sex, wing chord, and weight data fields fully populated in the correct format. And when Maren said she had no record of applying these bands to the laboratory, biologists read her the application dates and asked if she had been at the station on those dates. She confirmed she had been at the station on all 4 dates and had been running nets and processing birds on all 4 dates, and the biologist said, "Then you must have banded them. The records are in your name, in your permit. With your station code, it looked like your data." Maren said the records looked like her data because they were formatted exactly as she formatted her data. Species code, age code, sex code, measurements in the order she entered them. The specific notation she used for birds she released in good condition, and that this was precisely what concerned her. Because whatever had submitted the registration records to the banding laboratory had submitted them in her format. With her credentials, on dates she was present at the station and had not made these records. And the biologist was quiet for a moment, and then said she had never encountered this situation and would escalate it to the laboratory's data integrity team. By the end of the season, she had recaptured 22 birds carrying bands registered in her name with no corresponding entry in her records. And all 22 bands had been applied with data submissions that matched her formatting and her style, and her measured approach to recording bird morphometrics. And when she plotted the locations where the 22 birds had been originally captured, derived from the application data submitted to the banding laboratory, every single one showed a capture location within her study site's net grid at specific net locations she recognized by their coordinates. On dates she had been present, and she has spent the 2 field seasons since with a specific and unanswerable question. Beneath every morning at the banding station, when she reaches into a net in the early light and finds a bird that has already been banded, and a band that the laboratory's record says she applied, on a morning she was standing at this same net and does not remember applying it. What was she doing? In that time she cannot account for. And what was it that was standing beside her at the net, working in her method with her bands, getting the measurements right? Callum Dray had been an optometrist for 9 years, the last 6 as the sole practitioner at a private optometry practice in a small city in the upper Midwest, a general practice providing comprehensive eye exams, contact lens evaluations, and primary eye care for a patient roster of approximately 1,500 established patients, and a steady stream of new patients referred by the local medical community. And he had built the practice from a small acquisition into a well-regarded community resource in 6 years by the specific combination of clinical competence and genuine patient attention that made the difference in a healthcare environment where patients had options and chose their providers based on whether they felt that the person across the exam lane was actually present with them and actually interested in what was happening behind their eyes. And Callum was genuinely interested, had chosen optometry in part because the eye was a window into systemic health in ways that most patients did not appreciate. The retinal vasculature, a real-time visible record of cardiovascular and metabolic health. The anterior segment, a surface that showed the effects of systemic disease before many other body systems did, and he practiced with the attentiveness of someone who understood that a routine eye exam was in the right hands, anything but routine. The appointment cards appeared for the first time on a Tuesday morning in April. He found 3 of them on his desk when he arrived. At the office at 7:40 a.m., before his receptionist arrived at 8. Placed in a neat row at the center of the desk blotter, he kept clear of everything except his daily schedule printout. And they were the practice's standard appointment reminder cards, the small, pre-printed cards his receptionist filled out by hand when patients needed a physical reminder of their next appointment. The cards with the practice name and address printed at the top, and the patient's name, date, and time written below in pen, and all 3 were filled out in handwriting he looked at twice before he understood whose it was, because it was his own handwriting on cards he had not filled out. His own letter formations, and his own pen pressure, and his own specific way of writing the time in 12-hour format with it lowercase a and m that his receptionist did not use. 3 appointment cards for 3 patients. A 53-year-old woman named Patricia Vane, a 31-year-old man named Oscar Beaumont, and a 66-year-old man named Harold Sear, none of whom appeared in his scheduling system when he searched their names, none of whom had established records in the practice's patient management software, none of whom he had any record of having seen or communicated with. All 3 cards dated 2 weeks from that Tuesday, all 3 for 8 a.m. slots in the same day. He set the 3 cards in his desk drawer and went about his Tuesday and said nothing to his receptionist, and spent the day in the specific and controlled state of a person who has decided to gather more information before drawing a conclusion. And 2 days later, he found a 4th card on his desk, a single card this time. 44-year-old man named Dominic Farrell, appointment date the same as the other 3, and on the following Monday, a 5th card. A 28-year-old woman named Elodie Marsh, same date. And by the end of the following week, there were 9 appointment cards on his desk, collected from the 3 or 4 that appeared each time he arrived early enough to find them, always placed in the same neat row at the center of the blotter. It's always in his handwriting, always for patients with no existing record in his system, all for the same appointment date 2 weeks from the first discovery he had. By the end of that week, 9 patients scheduled in his handwriting for a single appointment morning that his official scheduling system showed as open. He booked the morning as unavailable in the official system, and on the appointment date he arrived at 7 a.m. and opened the practice. Alone and at 8 a.m., Patricia Vane walked through the door without an appointment call, without a reminder, and told the receptionist she had a card saying she had an appointment at 8 with Dr. Dray. And she produced the card not one Callum had given her, not one she could explain the origin of, simply one that she said she had found in her mailbox with no envelope and no postage, and behind her, at intervals of 5 to 7 minutes across the next 2 hours. 8 of the 9 patients from the appointment cards walked through the door, each with a card they could not explain receiving, each presenting as a new patient, each with no prior knowledge of the practice or of Callum. And Callum examined all 8 who arrived with the complete and careful attention of a clinician who understood that whatever was scheduling these appointments had selected these specific patients for a reason. And across 8 comprehensive eye exams that morning, he found in 6 of the 8 patients conditions that warranted immediate or urgent clinical attention to cases of elevated intraocular pressure consistent with glaucoma, one peripheral retinal tear requiring same-day referral, one hypertensive retinopathy presentation indicating blood pressure management crisis, one case of diabetic macular edema in a patient who did not know he had diabetes, and one optic nerve presentation he recognized from his training as consistent with an intracranial mass requiring urgent neuroimaging, and he made the appropriate referrals and the appropriate calls, and 6 patients left his practice that morning with clinical information that would, for all 6 of them, change the course of conditions they had not known they had. The 9th patient, the 20-year-old woman named Elodie Marsh, did not arrive, and Callum found the 10th appointment card on his desk the following morning. A single card, a single name. The appointment date listed as the following Thursday, and the name written in his handwriting in the center of the card was his own, his full name. His date of birth written below it in the field where a patient's date of birth was recorded, and below that, in the time field, no appointment time, but instead 4 words written in his handwriting that he has looked at every day for the 11 months since he found the card, in which he has not shared with anyone in his life, because there is no context in which to share them that does not require explaining everything that preceded them. And the 4 words are these. You saw them first. He went to his own exam chair on the following Thursday and performed a self-assessment with the instruments in his reach. And his eyes were healthy, and he has been to a colleague at a neighboring practice for a full comprehensive exam every 6 months since. And his eyes remain healthy, and he keeps the 10 appointment cards in a sealed envelope in the locked drawer of his desk behind the blotter he keeps clear. And some mornings when he arrives early, and the practice is quiet and the blotter is empty, he stands at his desk for a moment before he looks at it, because the specific and professional courage it requires to look at an empty blotter when you know what it is capable of containing he has found. Courage that must be renewed each time it is spent, and he renews it every morning, because whatever sent those patients to his door did so with the knowledge that he would look carefully when they arrived. And looking carefully is the one thing he has never needed to be taught. Rosamund Keir had been a certified 911 emergency communications dispatcher for 11 years. The last 7 at the Hayford County Emergency Communications Center, a consolidated public safety answering point handling police, fire, and EMS dispatch for a county of approximately 90,000 residents, processing between 400 and 600 calls per day across its 12-position dispatch floor. And Rosamund had worked the overnight shift for 5 of those 7 years by choice, because the overnight shift had a specific and particular quality of work that suited the way she thought: the call volume lower, the incidents more serious on average, the pace requiring a kind of sustained and precise attention that she found easier to give in the concentrated silence of a building at 3 a.m. than in the ambient noise of a fully staffed afternoon shift. And she was regarded by her supervisors and her colleagues as one of the center's most reliable overnight dispatchers. Calm on high-acuity calls, in the specific and trained way of someone who had worked enough of them to have metabolized the adrenaline response into competence rather than agitation. Accurate in her address verification and her unit coordination, efficient in her call processing times, and possessed of the particular quality that the field called situational awareness, the ability to hold multiple active incidents in working attention simultaneously, while continuing to process new calls without losing the thread of any of them. The calls that began the worst 4 months of her professional life were not initially identifiable as a pattern, because the first 2 arrived 10 days apart and were in isolation. The kind of calls that Rosamund's center received with routine frequency: a reported structure fire at a commercial address, Caller calm and specific about the location and the visible smoke. A reported injury motor vehicle accident on a county road. Caller on scene. Providing accurate location data, and she dispatched both in the standard way, and the incidents were confirmed on unit arrival, and the incidents were resolved in the normal course of emergency operations, and it was only on the third call, arriving 9 days after the second, that she registered something that moved the events from the category of coincidence into the category of something she needed to think about more carefully. And what she registered was this. She had heard the call before, not a similar call, not a call with a comparable presenting situation, but this call, the caller's voice, the specific street address, the specific description of the incident, the specific ambient sounds in the background of the call recording in a dream she had had the previous night. A dream she had written about in the notebook. She kept on her bedside table specifically because she had a recurring habit of waking at odd hours with vivid and detailed content she wanted to record before sleep dissolved it. And she had written in her bedside notebook at 4:17 a.m. on the morning before the third call arrived, a description of a call she was receiving in the dream, a caller reporting a specific type of incident at a specific address, in a tone she described in her notes as deliberate and over-prepared, like someone reading from a card. And when the third call came in at 11:50 p.m. the following night, and she recognized it, she reached for her notebook during the call processing, which was a thing she had never done in 7 years on the dispatch floor. And she read her 4:17 a.m. notes, and the address in her notes, and the address the caller was reporting were the same address, and the specific type of incident matched. And the caller's tone was the tone she had described, deliberate and over-prepared, like someone reading from a card. She said nothing about this to her shift supervisor, and completed the call and dispatched the appropriate units and confirmed the incident on arrival and documented it in the standard way. And she drove home at the end of her shift and sat at her kitchen table and read everything she had written in the bedside notebook for the preceding 2 months. And she found notations corresponding to the first 2 incidents as well, descriptions written in the pre-dawn hours of the nights before each call arrived, specific enough in their address data and incident description to have served. If she had recognized them in time, as advance notice of calls she would receive that night, she began treating the bedside notebook as a professional document from that point forward, dating each entry precisely, noting the time, preserving the exact language of whatever she had written in the hours between sleep and waking. And over the following 3 months she documented 41 pre-call notations, covering calls that arrived at her dispatch position between 6 hours and 22 hours. After the corresponding notation was written, and the accuracy of the notations ranged from general, the incident type and approximate location, to specific enough that on 7 occasions she was able to verify after the call that details she had written in her notebook at 3 or 4 a.m. It had matched elements of the incoming call that were not publicly predictable or inferable from any information available at the time she wrote them. And on 2 of those 7 occasions, the details included information about the incident's outcome that was accurate and that she could not have predicted from anything she knew when she woke and wrote them. Because there was no institutional framework in which what she was experiencing had a place. And she continued working with the specific and difficult discipline of a person who was receiving information she had no authority to act on in advance, and whose professional obligation was to receive the call, process it accurately, and dispatch the appropriate response And she met that obligation on every call across the 4 months, and the 41 calls were all dispatched correctly, and the 41 incidents were all resolved in the normal course of emergency operations. And then, on the 42nd morning, a Wednesday at 3:51 a.m., she woke and reached for the bedside notebook and wrote, in the abbreviated and still half-asleep shorthand of her pre-dawn notations, the details of a call she was hearing in the near-waking state: fire, residential structure, occupant inside, and the address. And she wrote the address and looked at it for a long time before she understood what she was reading. Because the address was hers, her apartment building, her unit number. The cross street, she said aloud to herself every time someone asked her where she lived. And she put the notebook down and walked through her apartment, which was quiet and intact and showing no evidence of smoke or fire. And she went to her living room window and looked at the building's exterior and found nothing. And she sat on her couch until 5 a.m. and then went to work and went through her shift and came home and went to sleep. And she has not written in the bedside notebook since, and she did not write in it that night, and she has been watching. In the 7 months since the 42nd notation, for a call that she now carries in her professional memory as a call she has already received and not yet dispatched, and she has not received it. And she has been a dispatcher long enough to understand that the absence of a call in the queue does not mean the call is not coming, that the thing you are trained for, the thing all 11 years of this work has prepared her for, is not the emergency you anticipated, but the one that arrives before you are ready. And she goes to work every overnight shift and sits at her position and puts on her headset, and she is ready and she is waiting, and the queue is open. "10 stories, 10 professionals. Technical writer whose work was being completed in the hours when no one was there. A triage nurse who found patient intakes for emergencies that hadn't arrived, and one for a patient who wouldn't survive. Pharmaceutical manager whose locked pharmacy was filling prescriptions every night for people who had been dead for months. A land surveyor who found her own measurements in a notebook she had not yet opened, and a note in her handwriting telling her not to go to the back corner. A medical records administrator who found her own file in a system that knew her future admission. Radio engineer pulling archive recordings of broadcasts from a transmitter that wasn't on, covering news that hadn't happened yet. A hotel manager checking in guests whose names belonged to people who had never checked out. An ornithologist finding birds she had already banded and records she had never filed. An optometrist receiving appointment cards for patients who needed to be found, and then one with his own name on it. And a 911 dispatcher who has been writing down the calls before they come in, and who wrote down her own address at 3:51 in the morning, and has been waiting ever since. What you just heard are not ghost stories in the traditional sense. These are occupational records, the accounts of careful, accurate, experienced people who found that something had been inside their work, not destroying it, not corrupting it, not interfering with it, but doing it, quietly, correctly, in their voice, in their handwriting, with their credentials. And in every single case, whatever was working alongside them left the work better than it found it. A writer whose documentation was accurate, a nurse whose warning saved a life, an optometrist who found 6 people who needed to be found. We don't have language for what any of that means. We have the records, and the records are telling you something. From True Terror Files Official, take care of yourselves tonight. And whatever system you work inside, whatever records you maintain, whatever calls you take, whatever appointments you keep, look closely at what was there before you arrived, because something may have already been doing the work. Good night.